I was taught that the universe speaks in cold equations, and that love is an error term that cancels out over distance. But the first time I heard his voice threading through the static, the math forgot itself. I was alone in the midnight lab, a skylit chamber on the windward side of our cliff city, where the sea chews the basalt and the antennae bite the sky. I am Aaron of the Ilex, a linguist sworn to decode prohibited tongues for the censor's archive, and I was cataloging wreck-borne fragments when a human, distress band extinct for centuries, blinked awake, like an eyelid in the dark. The spectrogram was wrong in the beautiful way. Living things are wrong, not clockwork, but heartbeat. Then the carrier bent, as if a hand cupped it, and a voice arrived. Hoarse, smiling through hunger, threaded with salt air, and that ridiculous human steadiness. This is Lieutenant Rowan Hale, United Orbital Fleet, if anyone can hear me. I'm not dead yet, and I would like to talk to someone who believes in impossible things. I froze with my pen between teeth. The old laws loud in my bones, the tribunal's oath braided around my tongue. We are forbidden to answer human signals. We are trained to wrap them in formal silence, until even their echoes behave. But silence felt like breaking a promise I had never made, and somehow owed. The message repeated in segments, a shipwreck of sentences oared toward shore. He told a practical story. A survey run through a quiet corridor that wasn't, a collision with fast stones, a battered lander skating crippled across an unnamed atmosphere and spilling a human into air that bit like iron. Then the practical flinched and the human poured through, casual and brave, and wildly ordinary, a recipe for coffee, improvised from kelp ash, the shape of his mother's laugh on rainy days, a superstition about whistling in dockyards. He spoke as if someone were listening because, believing that, is how humans make listeners out of ghosts. I should have sealed the file and let it sink into the archive, like every outlaw song before it. Instead, I answered 3 notes tapped into the telemetry in a rhythm older than law, our children's game, for I hear you. The return hail came back with an intake of breath that sounded like a harbor lifting its lanterns. If that was you, Rowan said, I'll tell you something true for every time you risk a reply. He kept his word, on the second night. While frost braided the lab windows, and the censured tower across the city snored in its own paperwork. He told me why he had survived when physics had scheduled him for absence. The lander had fallen into a storm like a mouth that decided not to close, and he had cut loose everything that wasn't heart or lungs or the stubborn list of things he'd promised to do. And somewhere in that unburdening, something had said not yet. He spoke without the pomp our historians love, like a mechanic unscrewing a story to show the thread on the bolts. He had learned the wind's grammar, and bribed the cold with movement, and found a shelf of rock that sang when the night wanted to kill him. So he sang back, and the night remembered it had other work. For every truth he gave me, I gave him one, the way our cliff city names its stairwells after constellations that no longer exist. The taste of the membraned fruit we peel with our teeth until we look like omens, the law that says we do not answer even when the sea knocks like a friend in the rain. Rowan laughed softly at that law, not because he disrespected it, but because he recognized the fear under it. Maps help until they don't, he said, and when I asked how he stood the hunger in the hours, he said he built a list each morning and put at the top a thing that would be ridiculous to fail at, like straighten this rock or name this particular wind. Humans tame catastrophe with errands they can win. I learned his voice the way sailors learn shoals, by the pitch and the little jokes danger tells when it forgets itself. Sometimes the signal thinned to a thread you could floss the teeth of a ghost with. Sometimes it arrived loud enough to ring the glass in my cabinet. Always, his tone found the one note in me that had never accepted the universe's insistence on being only itself. He asked me my name, and I lied with the truth. We give strangers Aaron, Ilex, linguist, obedient. He called me Starkeeper, which is ridiculous, and not entirely wrong. On the 7th night, the censure tower noticed the power spike in my aerial and sent a polite inquiry, which meant a knife wrapped in velvet. I wrote back about solar flares and calibration drifts and offered the sort of graphs that put honest men to sleep. Then I turned off the hall lights and asked Rowan what it's like to stand under a human sunrise. He didn't answer like a poet. He said, "It's like someone forgives you, and you don't ask who." My chest hurt the way it does when the cold sneaks inside a laugh. The tribunal arrived on the 9th day, not because they knew about Rowan, but because the weather had been too honest, and the city gets nervous when nothing goes wrong. Inspectors in mercury coats toured the labs and asked their museum questions, and I answered in the dialect of acceptable facts, while Rowan's signal reduced to whispers by the storm that had drifted back across the desert like an old debt pulsed at the edge of hearing. I needed an excuse to touch the antenna. The sea handed me one, a siren from the North Sluice. A real emergency this time, a jam in the floodgates that would drown the low quarter if the tide did what it planned. I ran, not toward the sluice, but up the basalt ladder to the roof, where the wind tried to throw me back into my life, and I leaned into it and said, "Not yet. Our aerials are bones tied to lightning. They shudder when you speak to them, like huge animals trying to decide whether you are danger or dinner." I bled on the contact Steiny, unholy, and begged the storm for a single calm breath. When it gave me half of one, I burned it to reach him. "Rowan," I said, human syllables sharp in my mouth. "This is Aaron. If you can hear me, say your sky." The pause that followed felt like the city hesitating before it chooses who to save. Then his voice shook the rain into order, gray as a steel promise. "And I am so happy to hear you that I forgot to be afraid." Below, the sluice bosses unjammed the gates, and the quarter survived, and the inspectors wrote a commendation about coordination and compliance that they never delivered because the censure tower chewed its own tail over a different problem. An unauthorized cross-species hailing keyed to my station. They summoned me at dawn. I went with my hair still salt-wet, and the truth beating like a fish in my coat, because I could not carry it out, and because I did not know how to kill it. The room was carved for intimidation, high windows, a table wide enough to host negotiations with weather. The chief asked me if I had entertained a human signal. I said I had entertained the idea of weather having a face. He asked me if I had answered any ghosts. I said the city is full of them, and some deserve replies. They let me talk long enough to document disobedience dressed as poetry. Then they suspended me and took my keys and told me to sit quietly in my assigned life until the report learned how to be a verdict. Suspended is a beautiful word for a terrible hour. It feels like flight, looks like drowning. I went home to my apartment where the plants were honest and the books kept their own counsel and the antenna wire. I had smuggled through a vent weighted like a vein. I plugged the room into the night with hands that remembered the work better than the law, and whispered his name not because it would help, but because wanting is a kind of compass. The signal arrived hurt, trailing static like nets. Rowan said his power cells were chewed to bone, and his shelter had decided to be a sieve, and the cold had new teeth. I told him I had been benched by polite men who confuse quiet with safety, and would he like to break something with me? He told me to find the old relay that our satellites had shed during the embargo years and angle it like a mirror to catch the last breath of the storm and bend it toward his hill. I said, "I am not an engineer." He said, "You are a mind that listens until machines tell you where it hurts," which is what engineers are when you strip them of their tools. I went out into the forbidden part of the roof, where the wind registers your bones and argues with them. The old relay was a fossil riddled with bird nests and stubbornness. I asked it to remember its first job, and it said no. In the creek, any old thing makes right before it decides to try. I laced it with copper, scavenged from a broken lamp, and tied it to a prayer that wasn't on any approved list. And when the cloud belly ripped open above the sea, the relay caught a sliver and sent it leaping to the northeast, like a warning becoming a promise. Rowan's returned voice carried a warmth that did not belong to physics. He said, very simply, that he could feel his shelter breathing again, and that if I ever needed a sunrise, he would find a way to borrow one. I should have kept our traffic coded and sparse, the way you speak to a stranger on a dangerous stair. Instead, we built a bridge out of tiny ordinary things. What we ate when the world was loud. Which street corner noise meant home. The names our families kept in their pockets for days when luck lost our address. He told me about a dog he loved as a boy, tragic and perfect, and made entirely of forward motion. And I told him how our people keep the bones of whales in the city square to remind us that something huge once trusted us with its body. He said, humans write that reminder down and call it history, but bones are probably better company. The day the Censure Tower came from my apartment, they came with courtesy and a bolt cutter. I let them in because running would have turned us into a story with an ending I already hated, and because part of me wanted them to see the room where a crime so gentle it could sleep had happened. They photographed the wire and wrote down the serial number on the lamp and measured the warmth, still clinging to the plug, and then they took me by the elbow in the brother's grip, polite. Menus on the way to a polite cell. They did not know my city as well as the rats do. Halfway down the stairs I slipped their grip and stole the door to the old aqueduct. A child's trick any woman who has lived with danger keeps in her sleeve. I ran the length of the dry vein with my own breath like drums behind me, and came up in the market, where the spice sellers shout louder than the police. I ducked into the stall where I buy the membraned fruit and told the vendor a version of the truth that fit in 10 words. The man I love is freezing to death. She looked at me like a woman locating the old emergency lever in her ribs, and handed me a coil of copper and a satchel of battery tiles, and pointed at a skinny wind cart with a missing wheel. Return the cart when the story is better, she said. And then the market swallowed me the way a school of fish hides a single bright wrong thing from a shark. I pushed the wind cart to the cliff stairs, and then shouldered the satchel and climbed the basalt, until my legs turned to law, and back to legs again. The antenna field on the North Ridge was a graveyard of good ideas that died of budget. I built our miracle from their bones, copper and hope, the relay and my anger, a battery tower that had no business standing, and stood anyway, because the wind and I asked nicely. When I keyed the transmitter, the whole ridge hummed like a choir, practicing a dangerous song. Rowan, I said, and my voice broke on the R, as if it were a real cliff. Hold on to me. He said he would, if I would tell him something true enough to keep a human hand warm. I told him my given name, the one my mother put behind my ear like a flower, on the day the sea first kissed my ankles. The name no bureaucrat knows how to pronounce without bleeding. He said it softly, like a man memorizing the way home. They arrested me at sunset on the ridge, with the satchel empty and the relay throwing sparks like half a saint's day. I went quietly, because there are moments when fight is a way of moving the wrong thing, and there are moments when being a door is better. The tribunal room smelled of paper and sea. The chief adjudicator did an old, brave thing. She closed the folder with my charges in it, and asked me to explain the shape of what I had done without lying to make it pretty. I told her everything. Not as a defense, but as a cartography of want. How a voice can be a country when you are exiled in your own life. How a law can be beautiful, and still be wrong about this one person. How humans seem to domesticate fear, not by killing it, but by teaching it the house rules. The room listened the way metal does when it is deciding whether to become a bell. The adjudicator asked what I would do if given the choice to disconnect with honor and safety. I said, honor without him would be a myth I couldn't use, and safety without him would be a room where the air forgot to move. She did not smile the way men do when they are waiting to punish a metaphor. She said the embargo was written during a fever and has never been revised by anyone who isn't still sweating, and that sometimes maps are for storms and sometimes you need to remember you are an animal that learned to cross rivers before it learned to draw them. Then she did the thing that will be my city's favorite story. When the children ask why the sea sings louder this year, she signed a temporary license for experimental humanitarian contact and told the censure tower to go home and reread its holy book for the parts where the index forgot to look. I left the room with papers that were barely dry and ran through streets that had never once felt built for my feet until I reached the lab, where the antennas stood like tall, tired elders who will still dance if you play their song. I tuned the world, and the world tuned back. And when Rowan's voice came through this time, it had the timbre of a human speaking into a room full of breathing people. I told him he was legal now, by a hair's breadth, and a miracle, and he laughed a sound that tasted like fresh bread. Then the sky moved wrong in the corner of my eye, and the lab lights hiccuped, and the sea stepped 3 paces closer at once. On his hill, something had decided it was finished, pretending to be a shelter, and wanted to be a funeral. There was a reactor under the rock he had called home, a small, quiet one that had spent a century ticking its way toward a definition of failure, and now it wanted to complete that sentence. He told me he could hold it with his hands for a little while, the way a parent holds a door when the wind wants to slam it on a child, but not forever. I told him I was on my way, and he said no, in the voice that had already made too many good decisions. He told me instead to bring the relay into alignment with the censure tower's forgotten west array and to steal the city's emergency grid for 9 minutes. I told him that would black out the hospitals. He said the hospitals had generators and he had the exact number of minutes of life to spend if I loved him the way I claimed. We had never said the word love. It did not feel like a lever until it did. When the city went dark, it did not scream. It sighed like a creature, surprised to sleep well. The west array woke with a noise like a cathedral rebuttoning its spine. I set the relay the way his hands would have, if they had been mine, and flipped the breaker that moved a civic river toward a hill I had never seen. Somewhere beyond maps, a human in a storm smiled, without meaning to, and wrestled a machine into remembering it had been built to hold. The minutes we bought felt like joy wearing a clock. In the 8th, the array spat flame, and the relay sang one perfect note, and the lab windows cracked in a pattern. I will ask a glasswright to copy from my front door. In the 9th, he said my name not like a warning or an answer, but like a place he had arrived at with his shoes still in his hands, because he didn't want to wake me. Then the line filled with a wind that had no business being underground, and the world drew a breath to invent our next chapter. When the power came back, the city cheered in 10,000 domestic registers, kettles and lifts, and argument lamps. I stood in the middle of the lab and asked the air for his voice, and the air said no, because sometimes the next chapter gets shy. It took a while, long enough for my colleagues to pretend not to have been watching me pray, long enough for the adjudicator to come stand in the doorway with her hands empty of verdicts. Then the speaker clicked, and a human who had wrestled with a small son and not broken said, "Aaron," and I remembered that tears are just the sea doing paperwork on your face. He told me the reactor was sleeping again, bound with wire and promises, and that the hill had stopped wanting to bury him. I told him the city had learned how to be brave in the dark, and that the law had learned one new word. He said, humans are good at teaching laws to love, and I told him we would test that. The embassy from his people took longer than hope, but shorter than history, and when their ship hung over the bay, it did not posture. It waited like a person at a threshold, asking permission. The embargo tore like cloth meant for a smaller table. The first time I stood in the airlock with the door cycling between us. He was shorter than I had imagined, and taller than my fear. He had a scar on his jaw that argued some other story, and hands that looked exactly like answers. We did not speak at first because when a room that was built to keep worlds apart decides to be a room, language needs a second to tidy itself. Then he smiled in the way that had made the storm take its hands off his throat, and I, who was supposed to be an instrument of distances, did the impolite, outlaw, irreversible thing the universe invented so it could practice being kind. I closed the space between us. When our foreheads touched, all the maps put down their pencils and watched. We belong to species that tell their children to choose safety like a religion. But the children are smarter than the sermons and know that the best safe thing is a person who stays. I stayed, he stayed. The tribunal revised the law in daylight, and the censure tower learned to hum in a lower, kinder key, and the city kept the pot hanging from the roof beam, so that when storms come, and we strike it, the sound it makes is not warning but welcome. If you ask me for the doctrine that governs us now, I can cite a paragraph and a clause, but I would rather hand you a cup of coffee that tastes like the ending of winter and point at the morning over the sea, and say that we are the sort of animals who answer when called by name. We are the sort who build bridges out of ordinary words. We are the sort who believe in impossible things until the impossible, bored and flattered, believes in us.